Okay, at this time, I would like to call all witnesses back to the table briefly.
This is Howard. I'm back.
Okay.
Hello, it's Nicole. I'm back as well.
So I'm receiving word that it looks like there's another vote going on right now, so we may be delaying another 15 to 20 minutes. So I'll keep you updated.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I missed that. Is the meeting delayed?
It looks like there's another vote going on, so we're gonna delay another 15 to 20 minutes.
Is the other vote Mark vote?
I'm actually not sure. Sorry.
I'll find out about that. Thank you.
Do we need to leave our videos on and everything right now then?
You can actually turn your mic off and video off, and I'll call you back again once we receive word when we're starting.
Okay, thank you.
Dean, can we check to see if your audio is working?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, at this time, we'll be calling witnesses back to the witness table. Sorry for the delay. Again, all witnesses, please come back to the witness table. We will be starting shortly.
Hi, Mr. Stubbe. Can we check your audio?
Sure. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All witnesses, if you would please come back to the witness table. We're going to begin soon. I repeat, would all witnesses please come back to the witness table? We are going to begin shortly.
No. Good morning. The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare witnesses of the subcommittee at any time. Members, let me thank you and hope that all of you have voted for the first two votes. What we'll do is we will continue to proceed until the end of the third vote. We will go break for the third vote and do the fourth vote and then return. So there will only be one break, and then we'll continue with our hearing. And we thank you for your cooperation. We'll all be watching the clock, but we'll proceed at this time. We welcome everyone for this morning's hearing on controlled substances, federal policies, and enforcement. Some of us are doing double duty. I'm wearing an orange mask, I believe, because I know that we are working toward a good response to the American people on ending gun violence. But today we're talking about trying to be problem solvers, if you will, in the ongoing war on drugs and the approach that has been taken. Before we begin, I would like to remind members, and so we welcome everyone to this morning's hearing on controlled substances, federal policies, and enforcement. Before we begin, I would like to remind members that we have established an email address and distribution list dedicated to circulating exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members might want to offer as part of our hearing today. If you would like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has been previously distributed to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as we can. I would also ask all members, both those in person and those attending remotely, to mute your microphones when you are not speaking. This will help prevent feedback and other technical issues. You may unmute yourself anytime you seek recognition. I would also remind all members that guidance from the Office of Attending Physician calls for all members to wear a mask even when they are speaking. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. An important early focus of this subcommittee will be examining the many challenging issues relating to our federal drug laws. For far too long, our country has taken the wrong approach to drug abuse, criminalizing substance use instead of preventing and treating it. I am particularly concerned about how our past failed policies has disproportionately impacted communities of color. For instance, in the 1980s, Congress adopted harsh mandatory minimum sentences for crack cocaine offenses, subjecting thousands of individuals to needlessly lengthy terms of imprisonment, even during the era of just say no. That didn't apply across the board evenly, and there were those who tried to say no, but could not because of their sickness. That approach was wrong and continues to be wrong, disparately impacting African-American communities while fueling mass incarceration. The data is compelling. According to Sentencing Commission statistics from 2019, 75% of the
What
people
reason does the
sentenced
gentlewoman
for federal,
from Connecticut seek recognition?
for federal drug laws were people of color. Half of the people incarcerated in federal prisons right now, 68,000 people, were convicted of drug offenses. 66% were convicted of a drug offense carrying a mandatory minimum sentence. In the past and now, we know that many of these cases involve people with a minor role in the offense. Federal prosecutions are not targeting the most serious offenders at the top of the chain. I believe it is important for us to see and remember the impact of our failed past approaches during the so-called war on drugs. Now, I want to make sure that we have not lost our members. Okay. And I want to put that on the record. We have not lost our members, but we are getting ready for a video. At this time, I'd like to play an impactful video demonstrating its effects. I'd like to pause for the staff to get the video. Thank you.
Nixon in 1971. In 1986, when I was coming of age, Ronald Reagan doubled down on the war on drugs that had been started by Richard Nixon in 1971. Drugs were bad, fried your brain, and drug dealers were monsters. The sole reason neighborhoods and major cities were failing. No one wanted to talk about Reaganomics and the ending of social safety nets, the defunding of schools and the loss of jobs in cities across America. Young men like me who hustled became the sole villain, and drug addicts lacked moral fortitude. In the 1990s, incarceration rates in the U.S. blew up. Today, we imprison more people than any other country in the world. China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. All countries we consider autocratic and repressive. Yeah, more than them. Judges' hands were tied by tough on crime laws, and they were forced to hand out mandatory life sentences for simple possession and low-level drug sales. My home state of New York started this with Rockefeller laws. Then the feds made distinctions between people who sold powder cocaine and crack cocaine, even though they were the same drug. Only difference is how you take it. And even though white people used and sold crack more than black people, somehow it was black people who went to prison. The media ignored actual data to this day. Crack is still talked about as a black problem. The NYPD raided our Brooklyn neighborhoods while Manhattan bankers openly used coke with impunity. The war on drugs exploded the U.S. prison population, disproportionately locking away black and Latinos. Our prison population grew more than 900%. When the war on drugs began in 1971, our prison population was 200,000. Today it is over 2 million. Long after the crack era ended, we continued our war on drugs. There were more than 1.5 million drug arrests in 2014. More than 80% were for possession only. Almost half were for marijuana.
Thank you. As the video narrated by Jay-Z illustrates so well, we need to acknowledge the failures of the drug war and the pain of over-incarceration, and we must then commit ourselves to reform. I'm reminded of the proceedings that we had when we were overwhelmed by opioid, and I, in this process of writing legislation, insisted to our then chairman that we must include crack cocaine or crack in the legislation as it related to the idea that it should be treated the same way that opioids, as it was raging across the nation, was treated in terms of sickness, addiction, and trying to provide support and treatment for those who are addicted to crack. In recent years, we have taken a more comprehensive approach to at least some types of drug use, including the opioid crisis, as I said, yet we unwisely have kept in place mandatory minimum penalties related to these substances. but at least there has been a greater focus on the need for treatment as illustrated by the enactment of the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act directed at those substances 5 years ago, right out of this committee. We must learn from our mistakes. One of the concerns that we will discuss today is our policy concerning the penalties for crime involving fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. In 2018, DEA used temporary authority to prosecute cases involving fentanyl-related substances not listed in the Controlled Substances Act. A year ago, the Congress extended DEA's temporary authority to group all fentanyl-related substances under a class-wide ban. I oppose this measure and continue to object to this excessive approach that expands the application of mandatory minimum sentences, particularly when there are other mechanisms available for the federal prosecution in appropriate cases. I do not deny the deadly aspect of fentanyl. That would be foolish. But I do believe that we have a way and a pathway of addressing this question, saving lives, prosecuting as necessary, but not doing the broad sweep and continue to mount individuals from neighborhoods into incarceration for life. We need to listen to experts and the data to determine the right approaches to our evidence-based and data-driven. It's time to turn the page and to create a new drug policy for America, including offering alternatives to incarceration and increasing access to treatment, enacting the MORE Act to decriminalize marijuana and treating drug abuse as a public health issue instead of a driver of mass incarceration. We've seen that with meth, and then we've seen that with the extensive opioid use. At the same time, we need to address the harm to communities and families torn apart by the war on drugs. There is a better way. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today as we move forward in a better direction for our communities and for our country. It is now my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of this committee, my co-leader on this committee, and that is the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, for his opening statement.
I thank the chair and appreciate the opportunity to speak this morning, and also apologize for my tardiness due to the floor vote, Madam Chair. So thank you, Madam Chair. This morning's hearing should be called Biden's Border Crisis is Fueling Drug Smuggling, which in turn will fuel drug addiction, death by drug overdose, and economic and societal distress. This subcommittee should be focusing on the impacts that the border crisis, which has been created by President Biden's policies, and the impact of those policies on drug trafficking. Additionally, how can we have a serious hearing on federal policies if we don't have a single witness from the federal government? No one from the Department of Justice, no one from the Drug Enforcement Administration, no one from the Department of Health and Human Services, no one from the Department of Homeland Security, and here we are. And I think that if we want to have serious dialogue about issues that all of us agree we are facing, we should have folks and representatives from all sides here. I think there should be agreement that federal drug policy must include border security and an enforcement approach that is balanced with other critical public health and safety initiatives. Such an approach is critical to enforce drug laws and help combat the current drug crisis in America that has reached unprecedented levels even during the coronavirus pandemic. According to recent provisional data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, between June 2019 and the first half of 2020, more than 81,000 people died from drug overdoses, signifying the highest number of overdose deaths ever recorded in a 12-month period. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported that synthetic opioids, predominantly illicitly manufactured fentanyl, commonly laced with other poisonous drugs like heroin and cocaine, appear to be the main driver of the dramatic increase in overdose deaths in the United States. Similarly, the Drug Enforcement Administration, which is the primary federal agency responsible for enforcing federal drug law, recently reported that illicit fentanyl is one of the key drugs fueling the ongoing opioid crisis in the United States. Other poisonous drugs like heroin, methamphetamine, and cocaine also remain difficult challenges to public health and law enforcement. But how do these poisonous drugs pour into American communities and cities? Well, primarily through drug traffickers and cartels who smuggle them in at and between our southern borders ports of entry. Just this month, the Drug Enforcement Administration in its latest National Drug Threat Assessment underscored that the production and supply of fentanyl to the United States is being driven by Mexican drug trafficking organizations, while China remains a main source of supply for precursor chemicals. The Biden administration's immigration policies are exactly the wrong type of action we need to fight drug abuse in this country. We've all seen the news reports. There's a surge of people down at the border because of President Biden's magnet policies. Whether the Biden administration or our Democrat colleagues want to admit it, there is a crisis on the border. A porous southern border and the Biden administration's inaction to secure it is a recipe for chaos and disorder. The Biden border crisis is also an opportunity for dangerous drug and human traffickers to exploit non-existent or ineffective border controls, which is becoming a real problem given that the Biden administration has an open border policy and lacks enforcement. The crisis here today that we're discussing is frankly more than just about drugs coming across the border. Drugs, people, and other contraband are now able to flow across the border because CBP is focused on caring for aliens flooding the borders and therefore is less focused on enforcement activities. In a recent conversation, I learned that right now 80% of CBP's activities is used to processing paperwork and processing individuals, and only 20% for enforcing the border. We must not turn a blind eye to what is happening at our southern border. The Trump administration worked hard to secure our southern border, and now the current administration, right out of the gate, and just 50 days in office, is reversing all the progress that was made in the past 4 years. For example, the Biden administration stopped construction on the border wall, even in dangerous drug smuggling corridors that were in the process of being sealed. As the co-chair of the Border Security Caucus earlier this year, I led a tour of the United States-Mexico border in southern Arizona with a number of members of Congress. The situation at the border is a crisis, and drug traffickers are exploiting the chaos to conduct illegal activities. On February 9th, I, along with over 50 Republican members of Congress, wrote to President Biden about the rising crisis at our southern border, which must be taken seriously if we're going to address the use and abuse of fentanyl and other dangerous drugs in our communities. We must not treat this as a political game. We must not allow drug traffickers to be empowered by soft border policies that overlook enforcement of our laws. I hope this subcommittee will examine how our border's insecurity contributes to the opioid epidemic in this country. Madam Chair, I thank you again, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his statement and his view. I'm now pleased to recognize for his opening statement.
Well, thank you very much for holding this important hearing today. Drug addiction is a serious problem in our communities. The current pandemic has further worsened the tragic impact of overdoses as so many Americans continue to struggle through this isolating and stressful crisis. It is time for us to act quickly to advance smart, effective solutions at the federal, state, and local level. This Congress, we need to continue our committee's work to take steps to right the wrongs from the failed drug war. As we have all seen, that failure has been both exorbitantly expensive and frequently counterproductive, producing staggering incarceration rates for drug offenses and immeasurable harm to families, especially those coming from low-income communities and communities of color. As our witnesses will highlight today, too many people are serving unjustly lengthy prison sentences as a result of laws that were enacted decades ago, imposing mandatory minimum sentences. That approach was wrong then, and it continues to be wrong, disparately impacting minority communities while fueling mass incarceration. Mandatory minimum penalties are unwise, unjust, and unfair. The status quo is unacceptable, and we need to take a hard look at reforming these penalties. We can tackle these problems and set a new course. For example, I was pleased to work with my colleagues in passing the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, or MORE Act, at the end of the last Congress on a bipartisan basis. For far too long, we have treated marijuana as a criminal justice problem instead of as a matter of personal choice and public health. Whatever one's views are on the use of marijuana for recreational or medicinal use, the use of arrests, prosecution, and incarceration at the federal level has been both costly and biased. I have long believed that the criminalization of marijuana has been a mistake, and the racially disparate enforcement of marijuana laws has only compounded this mistake with serious consequences, particularly for minority communities. Thousands of individuals, overwhelmingly people of color, have been subjected by the federal government to unjust and lengthy sentences for marijuana offenses, especially because of mandatory minimum sentences that give the judges no discretion. This needs to stop. That is why I will be reintroducing the MORE Act to remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act and to provide restorative justice for communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. We know that the war on drugs, we now know that the war on drugs was a deliberate attack on racial minorities for political purposes executed by President Nixon. It's time we stopped. We also need to learn lessons from programs and alternatives that have been successfully pursued at the state and local level, not just with marijuana, but with other drugs as well. For instance, law enforcement assisted diversion programs known as LEAD allow law enforcement to divert appropriate arrestees from criminal court and instead to provide treatment and other services that address addiction and reduce recidivism. Developed and initially implemented in Seattle, the LEAD approach is now being used with success in other areas. We should support these efforts, as well as other innovative approaches at the local level, such as medication-assisted treatment, supervised injection facilities, expanding the availability of overdose reversal drugs, and better education of doctors and the public about the proper prescription and use of opioids as pain medication. We will not be able to arrest and incarcerate our way out of a drug abuse crisis that has many causes. Instead, we must support the development and implementation of a variety of solutions as we consider our contribution to addressing this crisis. Additional reform is long overdue, especially now that we know from the testimony of Mr. Haldeman, who was one of Mr. Nixon's assistants, of the deliberately racially biased intentions of the war on drugs from which we're still suffering. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I hope that we can continue to find bicameral and bipartisan support for our legislative proposals. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time, and now it's my pleasure to yield to the distinguished ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The chairman of the full committee talked about smart, effective action to deal with the drug crisis. Smart, effective action would be to get control of our border, as the ranking member, Mr. Biggs, highlighted in his opening statement. That would be just common sense, but that's not what's happening. Not what is happening right now with this administration. In fact, it is so bad they're now putting migrant children in NASA facilities. So if we want to deal with this drug crisis and this drug issue, and I look forward to hearing from our witness, Mr. Malta, here in a few minutes. If we're going to do that, we need to get control of the border. And frankly, it's about time that the full committee have a hearing on something. I would suggest the border crisis would be a great issue to have a hearing on. Maybe the cancel culture, which is denying people their First Amendment free speech rights, would be a good issue to have a full committee hearing on. There's lots of things we can be discussing, but we have yet now, 2 months into the Congress, had a full Judiciary Committee hearing, the busiest committee typically in all of Congress, the committee charged with protecting people's liberties. We got a crisis on our border. We got a crisis with people attacking the First Amendment free speech rights of Americans, and we've yet to have a hearing. So maybe we should be doing that at some point here. But I think, obviously, right now, the border crisis is front and center, and this is something that we need to get a handle on if we're going to ever have a chance to deal with the drug issues that confront so many of our communities around the country. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'm sure we welcome the gentleman's very pointed suggestions, and if I might, as a resident of a border state, having gone to the border many, many times and have seen the influx of unaccompanied children in the last decade, I know that this administration is working extremely hard not to put children in cages. So I thank the gentleman for his comments. We welcome them all the time. We now welcome all of our distinguished witnesses, and we thank them for their participation. I'll begin by swearing in our witnesses. I ask our witnesses testifying in person to rise, and I ask our witnesses testifying remotely to turn on their audio and make sure I can see your face and your raised right hand while I administer the oath. Please be unmuted at this time. Do you swear or affirm, under penalty of perjury, that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God?
Yes.
Yes.
Is on video?
Yes.
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 Thank you. Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. We will now proceed with witness introductions. Nicole Austin Hillary is the Executive Director of U.S. Programs for Human Rights Watch. Ms. Austin Hillary leads Human Rights Watch effort to end violations in abusive systems within the United States. Her work is focused on addressing and combating systemic racism, as well as tackling problems within the criminal justice system. Human Rights Watch, under her leadership, has become an expanded and outstanding organization as the true watchdog of human rights in America and around the world. Welcome. Dr. Howard Henderson is the director of the Center for Justice Research at Texas Southern University. He is a senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings Institution and founding director of the Center for Justice Research. He is an expert on culturally responsive criminal justice research and has provided approaches to reducing disparities in the criminal justice system, a multitude of articles, and a great deal of passion. Dr. Henderson, we welcome you. Derek Maltz spent 28 years in public service with the Drug Enforcement Administration, including 10 years as a special agent in charge for the Special Operations Division of the Department of Justice. He now serves as the Executive Director for Government Relations at Penley. Mr. Maltz, we thank you for your service to this country. Welcome. Dr. Catherine Neal Harris is the Alfred G. Glassell III Fellow in Drug Policy at Rice University, Baker's Institute for Public Policy, a drug policy expert. Her current research focuses on the availability of drug treatment for all at-risk populations, the opioid epidemic, and the legalization of medical and adult use cannabis. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, for our witnesses testifying in person, there is a timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals your 5 minutes have expired. For our witnesses testifying remotely, there is a timer in the WebEx view that should be visible on your screen. Dr. Henderson, you may begin. Welcome.
Thank you, and allow me to begin my testimony by expressing my humble appreciation for the opportunity to testify on the impact of federal drug policies on the criminalization of people of color. As a professor of justice administration and the director of the Center for Justice Research in the Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs at Texas Southern University in Houston, Texas, I would like to take this time to thank Chairman Nadler, Subcommittee Chair, my representative Sheila Jackson Lee, Ranking Chair Andy Diggs, Subcommittee Vice Chair Corey Bush, and the remaining members of the U.S. House Committee on the Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. I must express more gratitude and appreciation to Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee for her unwavering support of our university, its students, faculty, and staff. Her expectation of evidence-supported research and decision-making has served as continual motivation for all of us at Texas Southern University in Houston, one of the largest historically Black colleges and universities in the country. Her support of our efforts does not go unappreciated. I present this statement for the record with respect to the congressional hearing on controlled substances, federal policies, and enforcement on this day, March the 11th, 2021. The testimony will provide a brief overview of the evolutionary impact of drug policies on the Black community. As suggested, I will present an equity-based framework for reframing the federal drug policies that will serve as a basis of my conclusion. In this testimony, I offer a structured and historical overview of the differential impact of the federal drug policies enforcement tradition. It must be understood that the inequality caused by federal drug policy is but a continuation of the historical process of cultural, institutional, and structural oppression. Federal drug policy actually has a deep historical and institutional roots that predate the 1960s. In the current testimony, I posit that the contemporary American federal drug policy and its relationship to racial inequality is only the latest chapter in an unremitting narrative in which the drug legislation constitutes the middle ground of a race and class stratified social order. In other words, this inequality has emerged from the dialectical production and reproduction of a racist logic as part of the broader culture of control. The objective of my testimony is not to say that the situation has remained unchanged from America of old, but our current racialized social order is not wholly divorced from the past. The crux of today's matter is that federal drug policy is merely another step in the long arc of history, representing an old Southern order that directly serves the spirit of white supremacy and absolutely refuses to accept the reality that they actually lost the Civil War. In this spirit, I posit that racist logics did not disappear with the culmination of the Civil Rights Movement. Rather, racism in our criminal justice system has transformed over time, with many strategies for stratifying and subjugating marginalized racial populations persisting in one form or another. American criminal justice, particularly federal drug policy, has often been on the front line in the deployment of such tactics. As African Americans, we are disproportionately displaced in urban ghettos, a connection formed in the public mind between ghetto residents and crime, which inextricably link perceptions of danger to skin color and other forms of expression present among ghetto residents. Ghettos were increasingly becoming places not just of crime, but Black crime. Criminal justice became the intervention of choice, an intervention that involves a direct and indirect control of urban denizens, but did little to address the root structural causes of the misery that spawns this crime. In fact, the impact of federal drug policies in these spaces have only exacerbated the problems confronting African American and urban ghettos. When contemporary African American ghettos were fully established in the 1980s, President Reagan declared the war on drugs. The central concern of the Reagan administration and others was the ascendance of crack cocaine as the next big drug epidemic. Crack was cast as a societal descent at the hands of crack babies and super predators. Federal drug policy in the United States continues to perpetuate systems of inequality and domination in that many ways mirror Jim Crow-like forms of control and ultimately violate basic human rights. As the line between drug legislation and plantation-style justice has become increasingly blurred in recent decades, federal drug policies have helped create, recreate, and manage a racialized problem population or a dangerous class that is pushed to the margins of labor market and political priority. In essence, these policies have helped to maintain the color line. Thank you.
Testimony, and thank you for the time in which you completed your testimony. And now it's a pleasure for Dr. Neil Harris, if you would give your testimony at this time.
Good morning. I'd like to thank Chairman Nadler, Subcommittee Chair Sheila Jackson-Lee, Ranking Chair Andy Biggs, and Subcommittee Vice Chair Corey Bush, and all members of the committee for this opportunity to testify for this hearing today. My name is Catherine Neal Harris, and I am the Alfred C. Glassell III Fellow in Drug Policy at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. I want to start by clarifying that the war on drugs is first and foremost a war on people. 450,000 people are incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses on any given day. Black people are overrepresented in every aspect of the drug war, despite using and selling drugs at similar rates as white people. Since 2013, the presence of fentanyl in the illicit drug supply has intensified the overdose epidemic. But it is overly simplistic to assume that opioids alone explain the current crisis. Instead, this epidemic is a sign of a more persistent drug use problem, one that federal policy has not only failed to address, but has made worse through its harmful approach. But we are now at an inflection point. The tragedies of the overdose crisis have forced a reckoning with tough on drugs thinking, albeit one made possible only because the epidemic's early victims were mostly white. Still, any departure from the drug war mentality is a welcome development. Support is building for reforms that are centered on racial justice and harm reduction. But bad policies are hard to dismantle. Drug bans continue to play a central role, demonstrating a failure to learn from the drug war's mistakes and a misunderstanding of the roots of the current overdose epidemic. And while recent reforms have reduced mandatory minimums for some drug offenses, this problematic sentencing structure continues. I will now briefly discuss each of these policies. Given the overdose-related risks of fentanyl and its analogs, the urge to institute broad bans and harsh punishments is understandable, but it is also misguided. DEA argues that its emergency class-wide ban on all fentanyl-related substances is critical to aiding prosecution of people selling these drugs. But an analysis by the U.S. Sentencing Commission found no evidence that the ban was needed for these prosecutions. And more importantly, the class-wide ban doesn't work. Fentanyl-related overdoses continue to rise, even as those involving other opioids have leveled off or declined. Recent analysis also shows that law enforcement seizures of fentanyl are actually associated with an increase in overdose deaths. The ease of distribution of fentanyl and its analogs make any efforts to diminish supply an uphill battle. And in the unlikely event that federal authorities do make a significant dent in the fentanyl supply, markets will adapt by finding an equally or more lethal drug alternative. And we know this from experience. Government efforts to crack down on the supply of prescription opioids in the early 2000s led to the spikes in heroin and fentanyl deaths that we see today. So while it might seem like the right thing to do, a class-wide fentanyl ban is not benign. It makes illicit drug use more dangerous to the person using. This kind of ban also expands the reach of an agency whose mission is to make drug arrests regardless of the harms and ineffectiveness of this approach. DEA tactics widen the net of people who encounter the justice system and are arrested, convicted, sentenced, and continuously monitored by it. Like drug bans, mandatory minimum sentences have not reduced drug supply, demand, or death. They do not work. Supporters of these sentences claim that they target drug sellers, not drug users. But there's often no clear distinction between these groups, and many people who sell drugs have substance use disorders. Also, the amounts of drugs that trigger mandatory penalties are a poor indicator of a person's role in a drug selling operation. And to this point, most people charged with drug trafficking offenses are at the bottom of the distribution chain. Any vacancies created by these arrests are quickly filled and drugs remain available. Law enforcement has wide discretion to decide whom to pursue with mandatory minimums. This increases the likelihood that people who have substance use disorders or who are members of minority communities already subject to government surveillance will become targets for harmful interventions. Mandatory minimums impose long prison sentences and are disproportionately levied against people of color. But we don't need more data about how these policies are harmful and ineffective. We need action. And there are several immediate steps that Congress can take to promote less harmful, more effective policy. First, Congress should not extend the class-wide ban on fentanyl analogs. It should repeal mandatory minimum sentences. It should remove financial incentives for law enforcement to pursue drug offenses, and it should expand access to medication-assisted treatment and fund interventions that reduce the harms of drug use, not just for opioids. It should also remove cannabis from Schedule I and implement measures to alleviate the damages of prohibition, such as those included in the original MORE Act. My time is up, so I will end here, but I look forward to your questions, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Neil Harris, for your testimony, and now we yield to Mr. Maltz for 5 minutes.
Chairman Nadler, Chair Jackson Lee, ranking members Biggs and Jordan, thank you very much for having me here today to speak to you on this ongoing drug crisis in America. I was fortunate to be the agent in charge of DEA Special Operations Division for 10 years. I retired in 2014. The operation had representatives from 30 agencies. We worked very hard to synchronize the efforts to go after transnational criminals around the world. Prior to that, I was the chief of the country's oldest and largest drug task force in New York City. I had the honor to work with the most dedicated American heroes who sacrificed daily to keep Americans safe. As a DEA special agent for 28 years, I was paid to enforce the laws of the country enacted by Congress and to protect Americans. I'm not here representing DEA. I'm a private citizen who cares deeply about American people, the public safety and national security of the country. I'm here to share information about the growing drug crisis and how it's impacting communities all over the country. After my DEA career, I continued to engage with law enforcement daily to stay current on the trends. I've always been a huge advocate of working together as a team and applying a true unity of effort. However, right now, we need more of a whole-of-government approach, but rather a whole-of-American approach, as the drug crisis impacts all citizens and all communities. Too many young Americans are dying from this poison. According to the recent data from CDC, in the 12-month period ending July of 2020, 83,000 Americans died from drug overdoses. That's 227 a day. This represents the largest number of drug overdoses ever. I lost my brother Michael in the U.S. Air Force pararescue during Operation Enduring Freedom, so I know what it's like to bury a loved one. However, there's nothing more sad than when you watch family members of these kids that have promising futures. We cannot expect to end the drug crisis with law enforcement alone. We need robust education, treatment, rehabilitation, combined with law enforcement to curtail this emerging crisis. Addicted people do need help. However, we cannot treat somebody in the morgue that already died from fentanyl poisoning. We need smart Americans from private sector in many industries to help provide solutions. We cannot sit back and watch these precious lives be lost. As law enforcement works to shut down the chemicals flowing to China and Mexico and billions of dollars to the ruthless, greedy transnational crime networks in Mexico, we need addiction specialists, teachers, medical professionals, mental health professionals, and others to step up with solutions. There must be a true team, coordinated effort with Congress and all of these great Americans that care about the country. That the killing of the Americans at record levels has to stop. Government officials leading this effort must be held accountable for results, not just papers and statistics, but results. These American transnational criminal organizations are not just engaging in drug trafficking, they're involved in arms trafficking, human smuggling, extortion, kidnapping, child molesting, child exploitation, and other crimes to maximize profit. They use the latest and greatest technology, taking advantage of our antiquated laws and weaknesses. Hezbollah terrorists are working with the Mexican cartels, moving millions and millions of dollars around the world, and tons of cocaine. What keeps me up at night, though, is listening to the families who lost their loved ones from fentanyl poisoning. Many of these citizens took a pill and had no idea the pill contained pure fentanyl, and it came from labs in Mexico or chemical companies in China. The Chinese criminals have stepped up their game, and they're big time involved with the drug business, and now they're involved with taking over the money laundering services business for the cartels. They also provide the dangerous chemicals and starting to dominate in other areas of the drug trade. Without the money and chemicals, the cartels can't produce the deadly drugs. There's no quality control of these chemicals in the pills. And remember, 1 kilogram, 2.2 pounds, can kill 500,000 people, according to the experts. To be clear, counterfeit pills with fentanyl and fentanyl mixed with other drugs is what's causing the alarming crisis right now with drugs. DEA Phoenix seized 6 million Mexi-Oxy pills last year, counterfeit pills with fentanyl. That means that DEA and their partners potentially saved over 1 million people's lives because those pills kill instantly. As we sit here today, we're dealing with a full-blown national security and public health emergency, as well as a huge humanitarian crisis on the border. Our brave men and women at CBP are transitioning from border to security to migrant care. That's no good. The Mexican transnational criminal organizations are taking full advantage of that, and they're flooding the zone. They're flooding the country with drugs and people. They can easily send special agent aliens into the country with dangerous drugs as they import guns and cash into Mexico. We need Congress to support law enforcement, provide the tools and resources to battle these dangerous adversaries and very complex criminals. The country is very vulnerable if the good guys don't have the tools. And right now, they're losing the tools in their toolbox. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today on this important topic, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. Now recognized, and thank you for your testimony, Ms. Austin Hillary. Recognized for 5 minutes. Unmute.
Jackson Lee. Madam Chairwoman, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman Jackson Lee. I appreciate the opportunity that you, Chairman Nadler, and Member Biggs have provided to me this morning to talk with you about this very important issue. In 2016, Human Rights Watch and the American Civil Liberties Union issued a joint report entitled Every 25 Seconds, the Human Toll of Criminalizing Drug Use in the United States. Our research found that at the time, every 25 seconds in the United States, someone is arrested for the simple act of possessing drugs for their personal use. The numbers have only worsened in recent years. We are way overdue for identifying and implementing more sound, effective, and rights-respecting policies to address this problem. To do so, we have to have honest, direct, and fact-based discussions on exactly what the cost of these policies has been, and equally honest discussion about what real reform looks like. First, we need to have a discussion about racial disparities. Communities of color and low-income people are disproportionately impacted by drug arrests and the unintended consequences of those arrests. The criminalization of drug possession has served as an excuse over the last several decades for authorities to significantly increase the presence of police in these communities and enforce laws on simple drug possession in racially discriminatory ways. Second, it is imperative that we look at the collateral consequences resulting from our current drug policies. A drug conviction keeps many people from getting a job, renting a home, and accessing benefits and other programs they may need to support themselves and their families. Federal law allows states to lock people out of welfare assistance and public housing for years, and sometimes even for life based on a drug conviction. People convicted of a simple drug possession may no longer qualify for educational student loans. They may lose their driver's license. They may be banned from juries and may face deportation if they are not U.S. citizens. And in many instances, some will lose the precious right to vote. These limitations amount to nothing more than labeling these individuals as second-class citizens. Laws criminalizing the possession of drugs for personal use are inconsistent with a respect for human autonomy and has yielded few, if any, benefits. Criminalization, simply put, is not an effective public safety policy. It is counterproductive to public health strategy and often means cycling in and out of jails or prisons with little to no access to voluntary treatment. Several countries like Portugal are experimenting with models of decriminalization. Several states in the U.S. are examining the same, with Oregon being the most prominent, having recently passed a ballot measure preventing arrests for low-level drug possession. The work of nations like Portugal and states like Oregon can serve as a template for what is possible in the United States. Now, let me be clear in saying this. Ending the criminalization of simple drug possession does not mean turning a blind eye to the misery that substance use disorder can cause in the lives of individuals and their families. On the contrary, it requires a more direct focus on effective measures to reduce the harms associated with problematic drug use. Congress has this opportunity today. Criminal law does not achieve these important ends, but rather causes additional harm and loss. The war on drugs was a flawed plan, and it simply didn't work. Federal implementation of mandatory minimums, along with harsh sentencing guidelines, has severely lengthened prison sentences and contributed to an over 500% increase in the current prison population since 1980. Congress now has the means and the tools at its disposal to ensure that criminal laws permit judges to impose proportionate sentences, ensure a class-wide ban on fentanyl-related substances, pass the Justice Safety Valve Act of 2019, pass the Mandatory Minimum Reform Act of 2020, avoid delay in passing legislation making sentencing reforms from the First Step Act of 2018 retroactive, pass the Second Look Act, and pass the MORE Act. Congress can make transformative changes to drug policies that finally provide an equitable, compassionate, sound solution to addressing these numerous concerns. That is what real reform looks like. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Austin Hillary, for that testimony. And as well, thank you for the divergent but also seemingly consistent view of all of our witnesses. And certainly, we do not take lightly the dangers of drug use or the dangers of cartels or large organizations. We know that we can, in essence, walk and chew gum at the same time and try to deal head-on with this horrible rage of addiction and the plague of major cartels and criminal activities. We can do that in the right way. So we thank you very much. The time is now for questions, and we'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule. With questions, I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. The answers of the witnesses are so very important, but we ask that they are succinct so that we can get as much on the record of your vital information as we possibly can. Quickly, decades of unequal enforcement of drug laws against Black and brown communities have resulted in long-term damage to families, economic opportunity, mental health, well-being, and overall quality of life. Certainly, Dr. Henderson, as you've indicated, it's impacted communities of color. We've been underserved in healthcare and other aspects of treating that disease and addiction. Last Congress, Chairman Nadler and I worked to pass the MORE Act. Isn't it true that we need these kinds of reforms to bring more economic opportunities to communities most adversely impacted by the war on drugs, and as well the ending of mandatory minimums and a different construct? Can you answer that question, please, Dr. Henderson?
Yeah, yes, it is true that we need more policies in that direction because we understand that a significant majority of individuals who are caught in this trap are doing it because they don't have economic opportunity in many of their communities.
At the federal level, what drug policy priorities do you recommend that are evidence-based and data-driven? What can we do to reduce this historic racial disparities that come about and generate mass incarceration with individuals even from being prosecuted in the 80s, still incarcerated at this time? Dr. Henderson?
Well, we can start. Well, we can start with decriminalizing marijuana. We understand the significant impact of that. We can start with also the whole notion behind federal drug legislation in terms of the way we schedule these drugs. We understand the impact of the schedulization in many of these communities. But I think more importantly, we need to reframe our thinking around the drug problem and remove the drug situation from the criminal justice system and directly place it into the public health arena.
Thank you very much. Ms. Austin Hillary, thank you for indicating that we do not have to ignore the vileness of drug use or drug sales. We can prosecute as well as save lives. And so my comment to you or question is, isn't it true that these penalties, mandatory minimums that are unjust and unfair, have a disparate outcomes for Black and brown communities? Please tell me your views on mandatory minimum sentences and how they can be counterproductive.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. They are absolutely counterproductive because they have a disparate impact on not only Black and brown communities, but on poor communities. In order to ensure that we have equity across the board, we have to look at all of the different factors that go into how we apply our laws. If there is not a direct outcome that relates to the crime committed, but that rather puts a burden on certain communities over others based on nothing more than racial intent and racial animus, then we have to do away with those laws. Mandatory minimums has done just that. Mandatory minimums have ensured that we have more Black and brown people in jails, despite the fact that based on research, Black and brown people do not use drugs at a higher level than white.
Thank you.
And so we have to make that change.
Let me also ask you, last year the Congress passed a bill to temporarily extend the DEA's authority for scheduling fentanyl related substances. We heard from a coalition of advocates opposed to the bill, including Human Rights Watch. What's your view on this issue now?
As I said in my testimony, Madam Chairwoman, we absolutely have to make that change. The letter that we sent to Congress, which we are happy to submit for the record, spells it out very clearly. And this is not only something that Human Rights Watch believes, it is what so many of our coalitional partners believe. We have to put a ban when it comes to fentanyl. And we can't go forward with real reform if we don't do that.
Thank you so very much. For Dr. Neil Harris, welcome again. 36 states, District of Columbia, and others have adopted laws allowing legal access to cannabis. 15 states have adopted laws legalizing cannabis for adult recreational use. Nonetheless, marijuana continues to be a key driver of mass incarceration. Why do you think it's important to remove cannabis from Schedule I of the Controlled Substances? Why is this action so important? How can Congress support these data-driven, effective programs like the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program, and how do these programs successfully demonstrate an alternate pathway for treatment of individuals struggling with substance abuse? I've combined two questions, two aspects of the questions, and the time is short, but I'd appreciate if you'd be able to answer. Dr. Neil Harris?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairwoman. It's very important for Congress to decriminalize marijuana for a few reasons. One is that it will send a message to other states that this is an important act. I believe that some states are waiting to see federal action before they go to decriminalize themselves. Second, we know that even though legalization is spreading across the country, racial disparities and arrests continue. Black people remain over 3 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana possession nationally, even though we have seen this large move for reform. And the MORE Act that has been brought up in this hearing is a perfect example of legislation that also targets the racial inequities that we have seen from the drug war by reinvesting in communities. Programs like law enforcement assisted diversion we see work because what they do is that they catch somebody before arrest and they put them in contact with treatment and with social services that can help with that problem. And they bypass the entire criminal justice system so that person does not become ensnared in that.
Thank you so very much. Appreciate your answer. I knew my time has expired. I now recognize the ranking member for his questions for 5 minutes, Mr. Biggs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Mulch, I'm sure you've seen recent news stories about the growing crisis at the southern border. And you touched on it in your opening statement. And my question for you is, what impact does this surge of illegal border crossers at the border have on DEA's, CBP's, and other federal agencies' ability to conduct enforcement operations to deter and interdict drug trafficking?
Well, right now, we have a situation where CBP has gone from border security and protecting Americans to migrant care workers. That's unacceptable because we have families all over this country, and I do this every day. I get pictures from families of their children that are dying from fentanyl. They have record-level seizures of fentanyl. As an example, in February, so far this year, there's over 4,000 pounds of fentanyl been seized. 1 kilogram of fentanyl kills 500,000 people. So we have a crisis. We have radical open border policies that will not work when it comes to national security and public health. And we have to deal with this. One thing I will say was an observation I made today, that walls and fences must work because it took me an hour and 15 minutes to walk from the garage to get here. So walls should be put up on the border, and we need to keep the migrants going through a legal process.
So one of the things, Mr. Maltz, that you talked about is you talked about flooding the zone. And a lot of people don't understand what flooding the zone is in border crossing, and we're talking between ports of entry. To express to us what flooding the zone means and how it facilitates criminal cartels using now vacated areas to smuggle in dangerous drugs.
So flooding the zone is basically a way that these business operations can make lots of money. They're charging the migrants thousands of dollars. If it's a special interest alien from certain parts of the world, it may be $9,000. So they're making money on the migrants coming up. They gather the migrants together. They watch where the Border Patrol is. They blitz the Border Patrol agents so they're totally focused on the migrants. And then they send the drugs and the people, many times special interest aliens, through these open areas. And then on top of that, the cash and the guns come southbound. So they take advantage of the vulnerability. That's what criminal networks do. They take advantage of weaknesses. And that's a weakness in our country at the border.
So federal agencies put out press releases several times a week touting drug seizures, kind of like what you see behind me. This is from Phoenix and Yuma. Can you estimate what percentage of drugs, people, and other contraband crossing our border are interdicted by federal agencies?
Look, I'm no expert on, border interdiction statistics, but I've heard for many, many years in the DEA, like 10% is seized, right? So if you look at, just as an example, in January, there were 1,950 pounds of meth in Dallas, 2,500 pounds in El Paso in December. Another 1,900 pounds were seized in Texas. In Los Angeles, they had record seizures of meth, 2,000 pounds, another 3,000 in San Diego. So lots of meth, lots of fentanyl, lots of cocaine, lots of marijuana are getting in there. But the thing that concerns me the most are the counterfeit pills that are disguised as what they call Mexi-Oxy 30s. They're the blue pills that the kids are taking, and they have no idea it's poison. It's pure fentanyl in many cases. There's no quality control. They don't have chemists that sit there like FDA and regulate the amount of fentanyl. They're just trying to make as much money as they can, and it's killing Americans at record levels.
And Mr. Maltz, as we get toward the end of your testimony, or my opportunity to ask you questions, you talk to the parents of victims of overdose and drug use on a regular basis, daily.
Right, and that's why I'm here, by the way. My passion is for the American people and the public and public safety. I'm not here getting paid. I have no agenda. This is Joseph Dean from Connecticut, 23-year-old. The mother had to put up billboards in Connecticut to get the attention about how bad this crisis is, the murders with fentanyl. These are all the pictures I get from families every day on Facebook. I don't look at the race and the background of these people. I'll take any photo that they send to get the word out there. These kids are dead, and they're not going to come back. They don't have a future because of this poisonous chemical coming from labs in Mexico.
Madam Chair, I request without objection that his three visual aids be admitted into the record. No objection, so ordered. Thank you. And with that, I thank you, Mr. Maltz. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much. The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized. Chairman of the committee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Austin Hillary, I just want to clarify, the letter to us you cited concerning the class-wide ban on fentanyl analogs opposes the extension of DEA's order. Isn't that the position in the letter?
Yes, it is, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. For Dr. Neil Harris, please tell us more about your views on the class-wide ban.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to briefly respond to the point about the border and the drugs that are coming across the border, and just remind everyone that the reason that we have so many drugs coming into this country is a direct result of prohibitionist policies. And the fact that 90% of drugs remain unseized goes to show the ineffectiveness and the fact that people are still getting access to these drugs.
Thank you.
Problem with the class.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, with respect to the class-wide ban, I was just going to reiterate that the bans themselves, when you ban a certain substance, people, chemists, traffickers, people selling, people using will find alternatives. That's how we got to the point where fentanyl is so prevalent in the heroin supply, because heroin was prohibited. So we had to people found a different way to get something smaller and more lethal to supply the demand that exists in this country. We have to focus on reducing the demand. As long as we focus on the supply, we will continue to see more deadly alternatives come to this country and continue to contribute to the overdose epidemic.
Thank you. In 2018, the New York Times reported that in New York City, Black people were arrested on low-level marijuana charges at 8 times the rate of white, non-Latino people over the past 3 years. In Manhattan alone, Black people were arrested at 15 times the rate of white people. As you know, I am the author of the MORE Act, a bill that would eliminate marijuana from the list of federally controlled substances. Could you describe, please, why this is the right policy and why it's necessary to help communities most adversely affected by the war on drugs?
The MORE Act is essential because what we have seen so far with decriminalization and legalization throughout the country is that the racial inequities continue. Even in states that have legalized, you continue to see racial disparities in arrest rates. The MORE Act is essential because not only does it decriminalize, which sends a strong message to states, but it also lays a blueprint for how to redress the harms of the drug war through actions such as barring discrimination for public benefits and social assistance and all of those important components. It bars discrimination against those for people who have been convicted of marijuana-related offenses. It also lays out a process for expungement for past convictions. And it also provides opportunities for people of color to get involved in the marijuana industry. What we have seen in states that have legalized is that industry is dominated by white men. And so the communities most hurt, most impacted by the war on drugs have been unable to benefit from legalization. The MORE Act is critical to be able to enforcing that and to seeing that progress.
Thank you. Ms. Austin Hillary, reverse sting operations are a technique in which the DEA and other law enforcement agencies approach people and induce them to rob fictional drug stash houses. The use of reverse stings in the Southern District of New York reveals a troubling pattern across the country. The operations overwhelmingly target people of color and lead to mandatory minimum sentences or other significant penalties for fictional crimes that do not reduce the flow of drugs. In federal drug cases, how do law enforcement practices and policies violate basic principles of equal justice, and what reforms are needed to address the racial disparities in drug cases and investigations?
Mr. Chairman, we need to make certain that whatever mechanisms are used by law enforcement, that they are not pretextual and that they serve the actual purpose for which they were intended. When we have law enforcement create mechanisms that simply put up falsehoods and that target certain communities, even when statistical data and the evidence before us doesn't show those communities are the predominant actors in creating the harm that they seek to end, then we have a problem. We at Human Rights Watch want to make sure that whatever policies and mechanisms are put in place are based on real data and real research and not based on any kind of political wants and desires and needs to increase numbers so that law enforcement can look like they're doing their job. Their job is to protect communities and keep them safe. And frankly, what we'd really like to see is more funding go to ensuring that people are healthy and safe and get the kind of support that they need to care for themselves and their families so that these issues will become less prominent and there will be a lesser need for law enforcement interaction.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Has expired. It is at this time that I'm going to call for a recess for members to be able to vote. Witnesses, if you can turn off your mics at this time, and we will call you to order after the vote on the floor of the House. Thank you so very much. The committee now stands in recess.
The hearing will resume soon. Can I ask that all witnesses come back to their chairs and turn their cameras on? Thank you.
I now call back to order the Crime Subcommittee hearing, House Judiciary Committee, Controlled Substances, Federal Policies, and Enforcement hearing today on Thursday, March 11th, 2021. As we left for a vote, and let me thank the members for their cooperation. I hope everybody voted twice, legally, of course, for the 2 votes that were remaining. And so it's my pleasure to now yield to the gentleman from Ohio, the distinguished gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Chavit, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And Mr. Maltz, I want to begin by thanking you for your years of service at the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, for everything that you and your men and women there did to protect the American public and save lives. So thank you very much for that. My first question, I believe it was posited by the other side a while back that essentially if we legalized or decriminalized drugs, we'd probably have less of that coming in at our southern border. Yet there are quite a few states now that have legalized marijuana, and the amounts coming in at the southern border has continued to be on the rise. So is that your understanding?
Yes, of course, but it's not just coming in from the southern border. Chinese nationals are buying real estate all over America, and they're making these unbelievable marijuana grow houses in beautiful communities, and they're selling very high pure THC marijuana to people all over America right now as we sit here today.
Thank you very much. My next question, would you agree that drug trafficking goes hand in hand with human trafficking, that we have a real crisis at our southern border when we turn detention centers into reception centers now, and when we basically say, come on in, and people are coming in, they're listening, and they think they can stay. And you mentioned it took you an hour and 15 minutes, I think it was, to get beyond the walls and barbed wire that we have around this facility now here in Congress, yet construction on the wall at our southern border has been stopped, ceased, terminated, at least during this administration. Again, going back to my original question, does drug trafficking and human trafficking go hand in hand?
Yes, I mean, the Mexican cartels are transnational criminal organizations. They're in the business to make money. They're charging these poor migrants thousands of dollars to be escorted up to the border. They're using them. They're tagging them now. They're putting wristbands on them so they can keep track of the money owed. So if they don't pay the money, their families or they die. And so you also had that incident in January where there were a 2,000-mile journey from Guatemala. There were 19 migrants murdered and burned to a crisp because they didn't pay their taxes to the cartels. And so it's a very, very dangerous situation. It is a huge humanitarian crisis, and it's really, really sad.
Thank you very much. And I read your statement before you came, and you only get 5 minutes, so you don't have a chance to get all of that in there. So one of the things you mentioned in there that I thought was worth bringing up here is the Sicarios, which a lot of people may not necessarily be familiar with the term, but essentially, drug thugs, hitmen, muscle that are training young, impressionable, drug dealers who get across our border, come here, and are setting up shop in cities across the country. And the propensity for violence that these people are equipped with and willing to do. Could you discuss that?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Mexican cartels are hiring former military and police officers, and obviously the corruption is through the roof in Mexico, so they're paying these people a lot more than they would get paid in the police jobs or, military. And then they get trained in professional facilities, they have indoor ranges, they have plenty of ammunition, and then they recruit kids, these young kids that just want to make some money, and they go out and they just start killing people. And it's very dangerous because they don't just kill people with guns. They chop people up. They hang people's heads from bridges, from fence posts. They send heads in coolers with blood to people to intimidate. They tie notes over people. There was one famous case where they roll heads on the dance floor. But then they make their way into the country, and then there's some violence in our country. There's spillover violence in the country, depending on how you define that word. Some people define the word as deliberate attacks against U.S. people. I don't see too much of that, but I see, cartel violence, right, at levels we've never seen. And I could talk all day about the stuff I witnessed when I was the head of the SOD operation.
And before I run out of time here, you had mentioned when you were testifying before that you're losing the tools in your toolbox. Could you tell us what you...
Oh, absolutely. One of the best techniques that law enforcement has is infiltrating communications pursuant to federal court orders. Very lengthy process. You don't just flip a switch and listen to somebody's phone. Unfortunately, because our laws are so outdated, the bad guys are using advanced encryption technology, and we can't infiltrate the communications. We have communications going on every day of the week in advanced communications, encrypted apps. And if we have a court order, if we have the probable cause, and the judge signs the order, we can't get the content. That's a problem, and that's a problem for every American. That's not a problem just for DEA. It's a problem for everyone in this room because child molesters, robbers, murderers, rapists, they're all using these apps. So law enforcement can't track these criminals. They're predators in the community. So it's a big problem, yes.
Thank you very much. My time's expired, Madam Chair.
Ms. Bass? Recognize Ms. Demings for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I'd also like to thank all of our witnesses for your time and your testimony. It is extremely important that we have this discussion, this hearing, and also hear your expertise and perspective. I want to begin my comments with this. I've witnessed the devastating effects of drugs in communities, devastating effects on families, individuals, and those communities. I want to quote former police chief David Brown when he was with Dallas. He said this: "Every societal failure we put on the cops or the criminal justice system to solve. Not enough mental health funding, give it to the police. Not enough drug addiction treatment funding, let the police handle it." We say in Orange County, Florida, that the Orange County Jail is the biggest mental health treatment facility and the biggest drug treatment facility in the region. Some families actually feel like were it not for those institutions, and this is really sad, that their loved one would not get any help at all. Chief Brown went on to say, "Schools fail. Call the police, let them handle it." He said, "This is too much to ask." What I believe, based on my experience as a 27-year law enforcement officer, is that the criminal justice system is left to solve problems that government has failed to address. I believe those quality of life issues, education, housing, poverty, economics, wages, are directly tied to our criminal justice system. Dr. Henderson, I'd like to begin with you. If you could please talk about what you believe is the nexus between the failures of our criminal justice system and, say, those quality of life issues in communities that we care about. I care about all of them, like poverty.
Thank you so much for taking that position. I myself spent a number of years working as a probation officer. And that's where I learned the do no harm approach. When you look at the war on drugs and you think about every 25 seconds, someone being arrested for drug possession, but you think about the families that are directly impacted. We know all the stats. We know that. But what we don't really think a lot about it are the residual impacts of this reality in these communities that have decimated many American families. Since 1971, the war on drugs has been estimated to cost this country over $1 trillion. When you now look at the current opioid epidemic and the approach that we're taking in that space, when you think about the impact of interventions, when you think about how many jurisdictions are now reducing fatalities because they are made naloxone available across many of these communities and trying to reduce and respond to opioid overdoses. In states like New York, when you look at syringe access programs, when you think about the over 60 international cities that now operate supervised injection facilities, when you think about the number of American cities that are working to implement approaches that are going to focus on harm reduction, when you think about the number of drug courts that we now have in this country to move us in the right direction, I think that we understand the harm, and now it's about time for us to begin to reverse that so that we can reacclimate and rebuild these families that have been torn apart over the last 50 years.
Dr. Henderson, could you or any witness, could you comment on some of the alternative programs to incarceration, like the LEAD program? If you could just comment, you mentioned drug courts, but if you could comment on the effectiveness of some of those other programs.
Yeah, I will. I'll do that. I think the LEAD program, it allows officers to divert individuals to treatment and social services, which is where they should be, because we know now addiction is a disease, particularly when you're talking about low-level drug arrests. The model that was pioneered in Seattle, it's yielded significantly positive results. Individuals who have been diverted to these programs have been found to be almost 60% less likely to be rearrested when you compare them to individuals who went through traditional criminal justice program. And so we know that works. The challenge that we have is getting people to begin to adopt the alternative philosophy to social control.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Maltz, you were talking about the horrendous corruption in Mexico. I know you were with the DEA for a long time. Have you ever traveled to Mexico?
Yes, sir.
And you know, they've got hardworking people there, right?
Absolutely.
And of course, I think it's wonderful when the majority of the people have a faith in God, which is what I find in Hispanics and Central Americans. And also they have a love of family. It seems that the number one problem that's keeping Mexico, Central America, from being some of the most vibrant economies in the world, one thing, and you touched on it, the massive amount of corruption. Are you aware of corruption from any source in Mexico besides the drug cartels?
I mean, I'm aware of the massive corruption up to the top in the Mexican government. The DEA actually recently had a major success with the arrest of the former defense secretary, Cienfuegos. They indicted him in the Eastern District of New York, and he was running the country's army, okay? Also, Genaro Garcia...
Literally running the country, Mexico's army?
He was running the army, but working with the cartels. And Genaro Garcia Luna was running their public safety. He was arrested and is in jail in America. So the corruption is off the charts with the cartels. If you paid attention to the Chapo Guzman trial in New York, there were allegations of the bribes they were making even to the former president of Mexico. Okay? So, yeah, it's off the charts, and they get all the money from America, and the money doesn't go to the people, it goes to the corrupt politicians.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned about people, and I've spent lots of nights on the border, days, but also all night, many times, and I've been there as they go through, the Border Patrol goes through the questions, you know, and they have their checklist, but a lot of times they'll add questions like, how much did you pay to, and the money all ends up going to the cartels. They sometimes pay coyotes or gang members to get them across. But most of the time, they'll say $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. And when the Border Patrolman says, you don't have that kind of money, well, I'm gonna be able to pay it off when I get where I'm going. I've seen them, people standing in line waiting to be asked their in-processing questions, and they're passing addresses. Oh, I like yours better, and they're switching addresses. They apparently are given addresses where they're supposed to go to sell drugs or be involved in sex trafficking, whatever, and they're given the location of the city and place they're supposed to go. You've seen that, I'm sure.
Right, and that's what I was talking about before. The most recent is the wristbands. They're giving them wristbands, and they're finding wristbands, which is actually tracking them as commodities. And if they don't pay, their families are in danger, and they're in danger when they come back one day, or if they're even in the U.S., they're in danger.
Well, I have read estimates like $80 billion just on drug trafficking that the cartels bring in. Now that they've been in human trafficking for a while, it's amazing. What a business model. Your employees pay you to be indentured servants for the future. What would happen if we completely secured, not closed, but secured our southern border? What would happen to the cartels in Mexico?
Well, the cartels are very innovative. They would figure out ways to get their supply to the unbelievable demand we have in America, but it would cause a lot of stress for them at the border. They would start using different methods, tunnels, and they'd use container ships.
Yeah, but we've got technology now, if we would use it, that not just the microphones underground like the old days in West Berlin, but we have some really good methods of detecting tunnels.
Absolutely.
There's technology that we have now we didn't used to have. Wouldn't you surely agree that if we completely secured the border, including a very strong program to find out tunnels, it would minimize the amount of money that's pouring into the drug cartels and severely limit the corruption there?
Absolutely. They need the people here to run their operations in almost every city in America. This is not just the big cities, New York and Chicago and Los Angeles. This is cities all throughout America. So they need the people. So if the people here, they have trusted confidants to work as leaders of their cartel in our different cities. So the people are so important, and that's what they're doing. They're taking advantage of the wide open border.
Thank you for allowing me the extra 27 seconds. I know it wasn't 56 like yours, but thank you.
Thank you so very much, the gentleman from Texas, for his comments. Let the record reflect that the bulk of those who are crossing the border over the years and decades have not come for drug activities, but have come out of desperation and fleeing
I would object to that.
prosecution that they are experiencing. So I thank the gentleman for his testimony. Let me now yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. Thank you so much for coming before us to discuss how we can really keep our community safe. I also want to thank the many researchers at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and that's in and also near my district. And their research is very critical to making sure that we're making informed public health decisions. Unfortunately, as we have mentioned, the CDC research shows that the opioid deaths have accelerated under the COVID-19 pandemic, which really compounds the tragedies that we're facing now. And I know that we've got to do more to save lives from drug addiction and overdoses using the tools of public health and improvements to our justice system. So I'm pleased that we're having this discussion today because it's vitally critical. Ms. Austin Hillary, in your testimony, you mentioned the impact of the increased incarceration of people for drug-related offenses on their family members. What family resources should be made available right now? Are there any friendly, family-oriented resources that need to be used for more support?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. And the answer is a resounding yes. You know, at Human Rights Watch, our research takes us into communities where people are directly impacted. We don't just sit behind our desks and pull up research on the computer or go to a library. We go to communities and talk to the people about what they want. And what we find from those communities is this, that families say they want resources not to figure out how to continue tangling with law enforcement. They want resources that help them to get better educational opportunities, better and cleaner housing, clean water, more infrastructure, and more jobs. So if we can focus our resources on providing those kinds of supports to families, that will have a trickle-down effect and will ensure that we will have less entanglements and less interactions between communities and law enforcement that are negative. This is what the people are telling us they want. And we need to hear them and heed to their desires and to their needs and not use our own erudite and sometimes very, what I want to say, thinking that doesn't hit the point and that doesn't meet their needs. We need to be talking to them and giving them the services that they tell us on a daily basis that they need. That's how we can support those families.
Thank you very much. We should always be listening to our constituents. So Dr. Neil Harris, your testimony mentioned several programs that you think can help improve how law enforcement interacts with those who have substance abuse programs. Programs like the Law Enforcement Assistant Diversions, or LEAD as you call it. And LEAD is the pre-arrest program, am I correct? But I believe that there are also other kinds of programs within the justice system as well, such as the veteran treatment courts that focus on getting veterans the treatment that they need and finding better ways to rebuild accountability. So do you think that veterans treatment courts can have some of the same effects as programs as LEAD do and I guess help to reduce inappropriate incarcerations?
Thank you for that question. I would say that I do think that there is potential for treatment courts such as veterans courts and diversion courts to help people and connect them with different services. I would still suggest and recommend, however, that our primary diversions occur pre-arrest, because once someone gets involved with the court process, then that means that they are still entangled with the legal system in different ways. And for people who have resources already, it's easier to comply with the requirements of those specialty courts. For those who do not have those resources, it's harder. And so I absolutely think that we need to be connecting people with services, whether it's veterans, other people with mental illness, people with substance use disorders. I would strongly urge that we do that prior to the arrest. And the LEAD program is a good example of that, because law enforcement can essentially hand off people to social workers and behavioral counselors who can then connect people with the services that they need.
Thank you. And Ms. Austin-Hillary, do you think that programs like these might help our justice system produce more equitable and just outcomes?
Absolutely. And that really is the goal. One of the problems that we are facing as we talk about these drug problems is that there is a lack of equity, that we have disparate impact that seems at times to be immovable. We have to ensure that we have equity, justice, and fairness. And these kinds of programs, as well as many others that we would be happy at Human Rights Watch to talk to you about beyond this hearing, are ones that we should be focusing our time and attention and resources on.
Thank you. And I think I'm just about out of time.
Thank you. Thank you. We now want to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stevie, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Walls work, fences work, and if walls and fences and razor wire didn't work, then why did Speaker Pelosi erect fencing, razor wire, and deploy National Guard troops around the Capitol? Yet President Biden is doing the complete opposite on the border, and it's literally killing Americans. Literally. I have the honor of representing Florida in the 17th District of Florida. Florida alone had 5,268 overdoses just in 2019. 35 people died of an overdose in Florida every single day in 2019. Opioid deaths more than tripled in Florida between 2000 and 2016, according to a state government report. And Central Florida drug overdoses deaths were up as much as 70% during the COVID-19 pandemic. The amount of fentanyl that has been seized on the border in just the first 5 months of 2021 is 4,552 pounds of fentanyl, which will kill hundreds of thousands of Americans. All last year in 2020 at the southwest border, 4,544 pounds of fentanyl was seized. So in the first 5 months of this year, we have seized more fentanyl at the border than at the entire year last year in 2020. And it is continuing and continuing to kill Americans and to kill Floridians. Now, I don't understand. The first witness talked about racism and white supremacy, and fentanyl doesn't know what color you are. And in fact, deaths in Florida, there's 13 times more whites than have died than African Americans in the state of Florida. And I personally don't think that it matters what color you are. We should be strong and hard on people who are killing Americans and dealing in dangerous drugs on our streets. Regardless of the color they are, they should go to prison. And like reforms that we've made in Florida, if you're dealing in opioids and fentanyl and people die as a result to you dealing, you should go to prison for life. And those are a lot of changes that we made in Florida when I was in the state legislature. Mr. Maltz, I'd like to, with those facts and numbers in mind, what are some immediate actions that the federal law enforcement can take to address this problem at the Mexican border?
Well, first of all, you have to secure the border. You can't allow these people coming in that are carrying these dangerous fentanyl pills that are killing kids immediately. And I agree with your point 100%. The charts that I have with these family members here, it's red, white, and blue. It's not red against blue. It has nothing to do with race or color. It has to do with just these Mexican terrorist criminal organizations that want to make billions of dollars. There's a reason Chapo Guzman was on Forbes' most richest people in the world. They make a lot of money, they take advantage, they destroy families, they destroy communities. So we could definitely shut the border. We also have to get together with the different professionals, the mental health professionals, addiction specialists. We have to have accountability on these programs. We can't just throw money at the programs and then say it's going to go away. It will only go away with strong leaders, and we have to hold people accountable. So that's something we could do. We have to get full cooperation between all of our agencies. We have to have the focus on the people that are dying, not getting a job when you leave government or getting a job in the private industry. It has to be about saving lives.
In your written testimony, you went into detail about the barbaric tactics used by the Mexican drug cartels, beheadings and torture displayed on social media, indoctrination camps to desensitize new recruits, including child soldiers, taking over huge areas of land while destroying roads and buildings with impunity, creating their own pseudo-religious teachings to brainwash members. You even compare them to Al-Qaeda. From a law enforcement perspective, how important is it that these individuals are not allowed to cross from Mexico into the United States?
Well, first of all, I was one of the advocates of declaring the Mexican cartels as terrorists because they are terrorists, the way they're killing, the way they're destroying families. They're taking advantage of society. But in regards to the cartel's violence, what about the stew maker dropping people in acid? So the the murder statistics in Mexico is very misleading. We have we have so many people that have disappeared because they drop them in acid. And so, yeah, the violence is off the charts, and these people are narco-terrorists. That's what they are, and they need to be dealt with accordingly.
Are the current Biden policies at the border doing a good job of making sure that that Mexican drug lords don't get across the border?
Absolutely not. I mean, when you tell the world that coming to America, everything's free. Meanwhile, our schools are closed and families are destroyed because businesses have been closed. It's not fair to the hardworking American people. And I have to say, this is a message to the world. That's why they're lining up in record numbers. It's common sense. You don't have to be an expert.
Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Let me take this moment to introduce an article in the record. Fact-checking Trump officials, most drugs enter U.S. through legal ports of entry, not vast open border. In particular, according to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, statistics show 90% of heroin seized along the border, 88% of cocaine, and 87% of methamphetamine, and 80% of fentanyl in the first 11 months of the 2018 fiscal year was caught trying to be smuggled in at legal crossing points. I ask unanimous consent to place that in the record, and I respond to myself. So ordered. Let me now call upon Ms. Dean of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for convening this subcommittee hearing on these important issues. What I am taking away is maybe there is one thing that everybody across the dais here can agree on, and that is that addiction is a disease. It is a deadly disease. And with that in mind, I wanted to start first with Ms. Austin Hillary. Analysis by your group, the Human Rights Watch, as well as by many others, has shown that despite equal rates of drug use, Black, brown, and poor Americans, as you point out, are more likely than white Americans to get arrested. I have to admit to you, I know a little something about this. My middle son is 8 years, 4 months in long-term recovery from opioid addiction. And yet while he was in active addiction, he is white and he was quite young. And I think his driver's license revealed that he was of at least middle-class means. My son never was arrested. He has no criminal record. And so while addiction didn't spare him, white privilege and socioeconomic status spared him from the cruelties and the injustices of our criminal justice system. Can you provide us with more detail into what the Human Rights Watch has learned about racial and economic disparities in the war on drugs?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. I will give you an example to help underscore the point I'd like to make. We have spent several years in Tulsa, Oklahoma. While we were in Tulsa, we were there to do research around policing in communities and to learn more about how police and communities relate. And what brought us there was the death of Terrence Crutcher, an African-American man at the hands of a white police officer. But we learned so much more. And what we learned from those community members is this. they experienced specific targeting by police. And we didn't only talk to community members, we talked to individuals, all stakeholders with respect to an issue. We talked to the police officers, we talked to the police chief. And what we understood was that members of the Black community there felt that they were being specifically targeted in ways that their white counterparts in wealthier parts of the town were not being targeted. That's what we mean when we talk about systemic racism. That's why Mr. Henderson in his testimony earlier talked about white supremacy and racism. We have to start telling the truth, and that is that racism underlines many of the policy decisions that we put forth. We have to learn and understand how we take that out of policymaking and focus on the end goal, which is protecting people and communities. Until we do that, Congresswoman, we will continue to see these kinds of disparities. We will continue to see these harms from systemic racism, and we will continue to see this kind of targeting. That's why the experience your son had is far different than so many of the people we represent and the people who we talk to in Tulsa communities.
And we're so keenly aware of it. We know that had he been caught up in the criminal justice system, he would be far behind in his career. He would be far behind in home ownership, may have lost his right to vote and other precious things. If I could go quickly to Dr. Neil Harris. With the American Rescue Plan, Congress just passed the most significant child poverty reduction policy in a generation. I'm excited to have been a part of it. Your testimony mentions that the latest research shows children with parents caught up in the criminal justice and carceral cycle are at greater risk of negative outcomes in adolescence and adulthood. Can you speak to that a little more?
Yes, thank you for that question. When children have parents who become a stand in the criminal justice system and become incarcerated, that disrupts their home life. It creates uncertainty for them, and it disrupts every routine that they might have that might be able to provide stability for them. It can interfere with their schooling. It can interfere with their mental health. It can interfere with their physical health. It literally impacts every aspect of their life. If they have to go into the foster care system, then they have to deal with that system and the disruptions that it causes. I know here in Texas, we have a lot of problems with our foster care system that negatively impact a child's life as well. And so it's literally setting them up at the most precious part of their lives where their brains are still developing with all of these additional stressful factors to deal with that impede their development. And later down the line, then it becomes more difficult for them to excel with education and employment opportunities, which creates a cycle where then they can then themselves encounter issues with mental health.
Expired.
Thank you very much. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Seeing the gentleman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes, Mr. Tiffany.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Maltz, thank you for being here and thank you for serving our country for so many years and still today. I think the humanitarian crisis that's going on at the border is well documented here in this hearing, and the flooding of our streets with drugs, the imported violence as a result of the Mexican drug cartels. And as we watch the Biden-created crisis at our southern border, the number of drugs that will be flooding through our borders is alarming. As you know, the drugs don't cross over by themselves. The effects aren't only limited to our southwestern border states, but are as far-reaching as my home state of Wisconsin. It costs Wisconsin's taxpayers over $10 billion a year to fund health care, emergency care, and other resources for the victims of this crisis. The highest overdose rates are in economically distressed areas that have experienced high rates of unemployment. These areas seem to have a steady supply of fentanyl and heroin, like coming from our southern border. Yet the latest statistics from Immigration and Customs Enforcement indicate an almost 66% drop in arrests at the border in February compared to December of 2020. I assure you that this drastic drop isn't because less immigrants are coming across the border. Mr. Maltz, you've noted that the cartels have formed a partnership with Chinese organized crime networks and that they pose a significant threat to public safety, public health, safety, and national security, and that they use sophisticated technology and take advantage of antiquated laws and policies in the U.S. First question for you. Some say interdiction at the border makes no difference, that the drugs will keep coming into our country even if interdiction goes away, or even if interdiction is improved. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely not. Interdiction saves lives every day.
What laws or policies need updating? So I think you've done a pretty good job of drawing that nexus of, this is not just the Mexican cartels. There's a Chinese government that's involved also. And so what laws or policies do you think need to be updated for us to be more effective?
Well, first of all, it's about the terrorists as well. Like Hezbollah is one of the world's most capable terrorist organizations, and we had Project Cassandra, where they were moving used cars out of America to support Hezbollah to fight and to carry out their agenda. So in this country, we have to first recognize that this is not just, drugs on the streets. It's about a global network of transnational criminals that want to destroy the country. It's a much bigger problem. But we have to realize, like in the Chinese scenario, the chemicals are just coming in ton quantities into Mexico. That's why we're seeing the huge amounts of methamphetamine. They produce like 7 tons of meth every 3 days. When I was a young agent, if you seized a kilo of meth, that was a huge case. Now we're seizing 2,000 and 3,000 pounds of meth. So the business operation is booming, the demand is booming, but it's all these other countries that are making money, and these groups are making money on the problem.
Thank you. So I would just like to share with the committee, in Wisconsin, we had when I was in the state legislature, I served for nearly 10 years, we created something called the Hope Agenda, and it was really groundbreaking in the country. A number of other states have taken a look at what we did, and we did things like create drug courts, expand drug courts, get assistance to help those with addiction. But we spent an enormous amount of time and money in order to create that agenda, do it in a smart way, to be able to help people with this problem. And we heard from local sheriffs regularly about the drugs that were being pumped up from the southern border, as well as the human trafficking that was going on in their communities. And they were emphasizing that to us regularly, and we tried to implement policies to help fight back on that. So I guess in conclusion, I would just say here, Madam Chair, it is so disappointing that the president, the first thing he did was cancel a pipeline that works for America, but then he enables a pipeline for drugs to the rest of America that's going to kill Americans, that he won't put a stop to that pipeline flowing from our southern border. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his testimony and remind of the article submitted that most of the drugs are coming in through the legal entries. And I thank the gentleman again for his testimony. Let me yield to the Congresswoman from the great state of Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for having this important hearing. I want to look at a particular aspect of this issue that doesn't get enough attention, and that would be civil forfeiture. In my prior career, I had some experience with this as the program I worked with started to represent folks who were subject to civil forfeiture. And it's a program that really has, it was designed to deal with the war on drugs, but it has a perverse financial incentive to have law enforcement target people to get their assets. And let me just give an example of one of the cases we dealt with in Pennsylvania. We represented a widow, a woman whose son was arrested for selling a small amount of pot at the house that they shared, while his mom, who owned the house, was in and out of the hospital. So he was arrested, and the police moved to seize her $54,000 home and her 15-year-old minivan. And so because it's civil forfeiture, this person, this woman who had been in the hospital and did not participate in any criminal activity was forced to defend possession of her home and her car. So, Ms. Austin Hillary, when the state or federal government accuses someone of a crime, the defendant has a right to counsel at no cost if they can't afford them, but this is not true in civil forfeiture cases. If my law firm hadn't stepped up to represent this woman, she would have been like so many of the people in our community who got swept up in this sort of dragnet, and she wouldn't have been represented and could very likely have lost her house and her van. Can you speak to how the lack of representation impacts these cases and really twists the incentives for enforcement?
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman Scanlon. You know, in an earlier part of my career, I worked on a concept that I actually hope our DOJ and maybe even Congress will take up again. And that is the creation of what we call civil Gideon. We know that, as you just stated, individuals have the right to counsel when it comes to criminal cases. But in examples just like you pointed out, when we're dealing with civil asset forfeiture, many people without the means are left unattended and alone to try to deal with this. And we know there's an economic and racial disparity with respect to that. People who are in lower economic communities, people often in Black and Brown communities who don't have the same economic resources, cannot afford counsel to fight back with respect to these cases. And that's what they need. They need someone to fight back for them. And so we really need to look at what kinds of means and mechanisms can we put in place to give them that kind of protection. Civil Gideon is a way to do that. But aside from that, because that's a dream of mine, aside from that, there's things we can do right now. And that's clean up civil asset forfeiture and this process and how it's implemented. We should not be incentivizing law enforcement officers to make decisions based on whether it can provide them with more economic gain and more economic opportunity. We should only have systems and mechanisms in place that focus on how they can do their jobs in the best way possible, how they can treat communities fairly and equitably. And that's the bottom line. There should be no incentive for them to make additional monies off of these crimes. That's where we have to start. And hopefully at some point, we can also have a good discussion about civil Gideon.
You're speaking to my heart there. One of the things that was particularly troubling about how civil forfeiture was being enforced in our region was that folks like our client, the widow with limited means, were the folks who were being targeted. At the same time, we were not seeing, the kid out in the suburbs who had done a pot deal on the side have his family's $100,000 or $200,000 home seized. So from your research or your work, has civil forfeiture proven effective at reducing crime or drug use? Or has it been part of the harmful impact on the same Black and Brown communities that were disproportionately harmed by other flawed approaches?
There's been a lot of research done, and there are many organizations beyond Human Rights Watch that have been focusing on this. And so we need to look at the full body of work. But certainly, we have seen that this is targeted activity and that, yes, it has a disparate impact on these communities. Just like the stories that you've talked about, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights has done a great deal of work on this. They are coalition partners of ours, and we know that they have been focused on how can we cut down on this disparate impact. Again, this is about the larger discussion of systemic racism, and what kinds of choices we're making, and are we making choices based on race and economics?
Time has expired.
Safety.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would appreciate if I saw Dr. Henderson nodding his head there, if he is able to respond offline, I would appreciate that, and I yield back.
I thank the Congresswoman for her indulgence, and I hope that Dr. Henderson will respond accordingly at a later time. Let me now, Mr. Gomert, I believe gentleman is not present in the room. You're reserving. Thank you so very much. It's now time to yield to the gentlelady from Missouri for 5 minutes. Ms. Bush, our Vice Chair.
Yes. St. Louis, and I thank you, Madam Chairwoman, again for convening this hearing. The vicious and carceral drug war that has prioritized punishment over treatment, violence over healing, and trauma over dignity has influenced all of our lives. Growing up in St. Louis, I saw the crack cocaine epidemic rob my community of so many lives. And I'm not talking about what I heard or read. I'm not talking about what I watched on television. I'm talking about the people who I was around all the time, people who I knew and was in community with, loved ones, I saw picked off and put into a system that was this revolving door. I lived through a malicious marijuana war that saw Black people arrested for possession at 3 times the rate of their white counterparts, even though usage rates are similar. As a nurse, I've watched Black families criminalized for heroin use while white families are treated for opioid use. And now, as a Congresswoman, I am also seeing the pattern repeat itself with fentanyl as the DEA presses for an expanded classification that will criminalize possession and use. This punitive approach creates more pain, increases substance use, and leaves millions of people to live in shame and isolation as they battle drug use with limited support and healing. And if you don't know it, go into the communities and start sitting with people and really hearing their stories and finding out their struggles. Sometimes you got to do the deep work. This is an issue that affects all communities, from my neighborhood in St. Louis to the edge of Lake Erie in Ohio. And somehow we have put aside science and compassion in favor of trauma and punishment, all the while leaving people to fend for themselves. Dr. Harris, why is national drug policy reform essential for reducing the federal prison population and for providing states with a blueprint for effective policy change?
Thank you for your question and for your passion on this issue. Federal reform is essential for states to follow suit. We saw this, if you look back in the 1980s, when the federal government ratcheted up penalties for cocaine, for crack, and the disparities it created for crack and cocaine, we saw the states follow suit. And so we know that the states will do what we see the federal government do on these issues. So if the federal government takes leadership, we will see more responsible policy at the state level. We also know that punishment does not work. We've been talking a lot about mandatory minimums here. Mandatory minimums levy very severe sentences, but they do not deter people from using drugs. The very nature of addiction suggests that people are not going to they will use drugs regardless of what the consequences are. And so that approach will not work. We've been talking a lot about the demand for drugs and the cartels. Absolutely, cartels can be dangerous organizations and very profitable. That is because of the demand for drugs that we have in the United States. And we have not addressed that demand. We have 40 years to show that we have not addressed that demand. And it is time to try something else instead of continuing the same failed policies.
Thank you, because our jails were not originally purposed to be treatment centers. And yet our jails have become the largest mental health institutions in America. This is sickening. People with a history of substance use are being sent to jails and have been for a long time that are in no way equipped to treat their trauma or addiction. This is a public health crisis. Too often drug offenses are born out of poverty. And if we don't want to actually address poverty, then this is the situation. This system allows those with wealth to more easily escape the trauma of police raids, civil asset forfeiture, and mandatory minimums, which you all have been talking about, because they can afford those top-notch treatments while the rest of the country is left to hurt in silence. So, Ms. Hillary, what is your main concern about mandatory minimum sentencing for drug offenses and its devastating collateral impact on people's lives? And then when you answer that, is there any reason that these types of crimes should be treated differently than other offenses?
Quickly, Congresswoman, thank you. My main concern is that mandatory minimums are excessive. It's like using a sledgehammer to put a small tack into a wall. It's too much and it doesn't really do the job. That's number one. Number two, we need to look at each instance of crime, each type of abuse, each type of circumstance separately. We cannot use one method and say, this is going to solve all our problems. There is not a panacea for how we address these issues, and that's what we've been talking about today. We need to be particularized, we need to use real evidence and real data.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you so very much. The colleagues on the other side continues to reserve, and it's my privilege now to call upon Mr. Cicilline for 5 minutes.
Thank you to you, Chairwoman Jackson Lee, and to Chairman Nadler for organizing this hearing today, and thank you to our witnesses for sharing their expertise on how to improve drug policy and work toward addressing the decades of federal drug policy in this country. Let me just fix that here, sorry. The war on drugs, we know, has led to the over-criminalization of Americans, with communities of color experiencing over-surveillance, leading to increased arrests and disproportionately harsh sentences. And last week, the House passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which takes a major step to holding police officers accountable for misconduct. But equally important is Congress's responsibility to examine how drug laws contribute to increased law enforcement interventions, unnecessary incarcerations, when public health alternatives are often much more appropriate. And so my first question is to Ms. Austin-Hillary. In your written testimony, you recommend that Congress shift resources from the policing of drug use toward access to evidence-based treatment and other voluntary supports for people who struggle with substance abuse disorder. Can you elaborate and really discuss the importance of the need to take a public health approach to addressing drug abuse as opposed to the approach that we've taken in the war on drugs?
Yes, and thank you, Congressman, for that question. We know from research that we've done at Human Rights Watch, and not only do we have the program that I oversee, the US program, we also have experts in-house who deal with health issues. And we know that individuals have to have issues around their medical care, around their physical being addressed by medical experts. If you have an individual, for instance, and I've spent time, as I said, Human Rights Watch, we go to the communities. I've spent time in Florida in a van going around with one of the community groups that goes around the community and deals with individuals who are dealing with drug issues. And what I'm seeing is that those people are saying to us that they are most helped when they have doctors and nurses who are in their communities. They say they are not helped when they're picked up by police officers, when they are taken to court, where they can't afford bail, where they can't afford lawyers. And all those things are a whole nother host of questions and issues. What they're saying is that they are most helped and that their opportunity for healing and for taking better care of themselves and their families is through better access to health care and to the medical community. So again, we have to give people the best opportunity to heal and to move themselves into a better situation. That's not through criminalization, that is through healthcare. And the medical science backs this up and supports this. So let's start having real conversations about how we put dollars there instead of dollars into furthering law enforcement's ability to target these communities and these individuals.
Thank you. And Dr. Neil Harris, as we all know, America's opioid crisis is far from resolved. According to the American Medical Association, over 40 states have reported an increase in opioid overdose deaths since the beginning of the pandemic. And in my home state of Rhode Island, opioid overdose remains the leading cause of accidental death. Every day, we are at risk of losing more and more people to overdoses, with recent numbers showing that Black and Hispanic Rhode Islanders are disproportionately experiencing overdose-related deaths. Through various research trials, evidence has shown that medication-assisted treatment is an effective treatment for opioid addiction. And we have some great leadership in Rhode Island from the medical community that's been really leading this effort, particularly at Brown University. And so my question is, do you think that these programs should receive more federal support? Are there other programs that also should be available? But what are the most efficacious ways to provide the kind of treatment that will have a meaningful impact on this problem?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. I like to think about this in terms of short-term and long-term solutions. And when we talk about reducing overdoses, we're talking about these short-term solutions to provide treatment and immediate interventions. Rhode Island has done a great job at increasing access for medication-assisted treatment, especially for people that are in the criminal justice system. I would like to see federal funding go to expanding the access to medication-assisted treatment within correctional systems in all states. And not just for Vivitrol, which tends to be preferred because it's an opioid antagonist, but also for methadone and Suboxone, because people need the option that works best for them. The other thing that I think that the federal government can do, in addition to expanding access for needle exchange programs and authorizing safe consumption sites, is to expand access to drug testing services. Mr. Maltz had mentioned the problem of counterfeit pills. Absolutely, when people unknowingly take pills that they think are legitimate prescriptions and they contain fentanyl in them, that is very dangerous. If we provide people with resources so that they can test those substances and determine whether there's fentanyl in them, research shows that they will moderate their drug use behaviors and can use in a safer way. And so we need to focus on those harm reduction interventions.
Great. Thank you so much. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu. Happy to yield now 5 minutes to the gentleman from California as well, Mr. Correa. Gentleman is
Madam Chair, can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
Hear you very well, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much for holding this very, very important hearing. I'm out of Orange County, California. One of the things I did the last few months was to visit our juvenile hall, where I found that most of the young ladies in juvenile hall are there because of prostitution. Prostitution related to trying to raise money by selling their souls and bodies to pay for drugs. I also have a good relationship with the local police officers, good police officers, and it breaks my heart to know that we're giving them the impossible job of fixing our societal problems of homelessness, drug addiction, and mental health. You know, you take a deep breath and you think about the decades-long war on drugs, 4, maybe 5 decades of this war. And I have a question for each one of our panelists here today. Are we winning the war on drugs? Ms. Austin Hollerith, yes or no?
We are not winning the war on drugs. The numbers show that the
Mr. Henderson, yes or no?
No, we're not.
Mr. Maltz.
No, we're not. I'm sorry. But we
Ms.
are making
Neil
a difference,
Harris,
saving lives.
yes or no? Thank you. Ms. Neil Harris, are we winning the war on drugs?
No, we are not.
Yes or no question to each one of our panelists. Do the incarceration of drug addicts, does that help them go straight? Yes or no? Just jail straight out drug addicts. Ms. Austin Hollerith.
No.
Mr. Henderson.
No.
Mr. Maltz.
Can't answer that question. It's too vague.
Putting a drug addict in jail, does that straighten him or her out?
If they have a drug addiction
Yes or
issue,
no?
jail is not the answer.
Thank you. Ms. Neil Harris.
No.
Thank you very much. Ms. Austin Hollerith, should we study what other states are doing, what other nations are doing when it comes to addressing drug addiction? Treatment instead of rehabilitation, I should say treatment, rehabilitation instead of jail. Should we address drug addiction as a medical issue instead of a criminal issue?
Absolutely, yes.
Mr. Maltz.
Drug addiction must be dealt with the professionals.
Is a medical issue or is a medical issue? Excuse me, is a medical or criminal issue?
Addiction's a medical issue, of course.
Mr. Henderson.
Yes, we should.
Ms. Austin Hollerith.
Yes, we should. And Congressman.
Mr. Maltz, you talked about Mexican cartels and corruption. Is that not corruption fueled by American dollars? Dollars from American drug users, yes or no?
Well, certainly there's millions and millions of dollars being generated from the demand here in America, but corruption is a
Yes or
separate
no?
issue.
Are those dollars fueling corruption around the world?
Obviously.
Yes or no? That's a yes, correct?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Maltz, if we seal the southern border, will that stop Americans from using illegal drugs?
It will help.
So Chinese chemicals precursors that don't come in through Mexico, they won't come through Canada?
They might.
Might. Would you consider the Canadian border secure?
I don't think it's very secure because all the resources are going to the southern border now.
So they're both insecure. Would you consider our Atlantic and Pacific ports secure when it comes to drug trade, Mr. Maltz?
CBP needs more resources to secure these borders. It's impossible to do it with what they have.
secure? Yes. Are they secure, yes or no?
They're doing a great job, absolutely.
So the ports are secure from drug trade?
Not totally secure, but they're making a lot of seizures.
Yes? Yes or no? Okay. And finally, Mr. Maltz, America is good when it puts its focus on a certain effort. A few decades ago, we essentially sealed off the Caribbean when it came to drug trade. We're pretty good at sealing that up. But what we ended up doing was really diverting that drug trade inland. In that process, we essentially destabilized the countries of a whole continent, Mexico and Central America, and yet the drugs kept flowing. That's why I'm saying this drug trade, this drug war, 4, 5, 6 decades has not worked. And my question to you, sir, do you think sealing the Mexican border will bring us success when it comes to the drug war?
100% it will help. It's not going to solve the problem 100%, but it will help for sure.
So Americans will stop using drugs once you seal the Mexican border?
I never said that.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Would Americans stop? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Now yielding to the gentleman from Utah for 5 minutes, Mr. Owens.
Well, you have 15 seconds or so to wrap up anything that you're trying to say during that last interaction, or you're okay?
I mean, obviously, sealing the border is not going to stop the addiction all over America because it's been out of control for so many years. We didn't put the money into the education, to the treatment, to the rehabilitation. We ignored it. All these poor people got addicted. And the cartels took complete advantage of the addicted population to make billions of dollars. But securing the border is going to help keep these poisonous drugs out of the country, yes.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm glad we're having this conversation. It's a very important issue to me. I grew up in the 1960s segregated community where the progress into the Black middle class was an expectation for us. Our family unit was strong, and drugs simply were not a part of our everyday life. Over the last few decades since, I witnessed friends, NFL careers lost, families destroyed by drug abuse. It is a fact that the least control we have over our borders, the more control Mexican drug cartels have on bringing misery to both my state and the Black community. Here are a few statistics that have been really troubling to me. Fact, illegal drug use among Blacks is 23% higher than the general population and whites. Fact, 78% of the overdose in Washington, D.C. are African Americans. Fact, in D.C., opioid overdose deaths among Black men between ages of 40 to 69 increased 245% between 2014 and 2017. Fact, in Utah, 473 drug overdose deaths involved opioids in 2018. With that in mind, Mr. Maltz, the smuggling of drugs along the southwest border by the Mexican cartel is one of the greatest threats to the American dream. What is the most important thing the federal government can do today to stop the flow of drugs into our country?
Well, for one, they have to talk about the issues with drugs. It's not just overprescribing. That's 15, 20 years ago. We never dealt with that as a country. They have to get people help. They have to unite all the smart people in America that have good ideas, but we have to shut down that border, and we have to show the American public we care about the families that are being destroyed. We have to take this serious. Right now, people just seem to think it's going to go away. It's going to get worse every day. More and more of these kids are going to die. And by the way, fentanyl doesn't care what color you are. It's going to kill you if you snort it, right? If you take fentanyl, there's a good chance you're going to die. And sadly, most of the kids don't even know what they're taking. And the cartels are making billions off this.
Do you have any insight into the drug trafficking path into the inner part of our United States? For states like mine that are not on the border, but are still being impacted by this process of drugs coming through our borders?
Well, the Sinaloa cartel and Jalisco New Generation cartel are throughout all the American cities, right? They have command and control set up in some of the biggest cities, like in Chicago and Arizona and Los Angeles and New York and and Atlanta. And what they're doing is they're spreading out their command and control. With the people that are coming over the border, they're setting them up in these different cities, and they basically have the opportunity to push drugs on the streets all over. They're pushing their drugs to gangs, right? The Chapo Guzman case, if you look into that, it was the Sinaloa cartel providing all these drugs to the gangs on the west side of Chicago. So it goes from the command and control in Mexico right to the command and control in these hub cities and right into your city.
So in other words, zip code is not a protection against these drugs coming on our south.
There's no boundary, sir.
Okay. What is the connection between the border security and the prevalence of illegal drugs in urban America? Those that are most at risk, those communities that I've just listed are being hit the hardest. What is the connection between our security at the border and that of impacting the communities that we should all be caring about at this point?
Well, like we said all day so far, like when the border's open, these people can get in here, they bring the fentanyl pills, they distribute the pills all over the cities, and people are dying. So everybody's vulnerable. This is poison in counterfeit pills. If you take a pill and you think it's a legitimate OxyContin, but it has fentanyl that was put in it from a lab in Mexico, you're going to die. And so everybody's vulnerable.
Let me just wrap up with this. The greatest thing about our country is the access to American dream, the middle class. And I think Americans need to understand this is a way to negate our middle class. Have death, misery, and addiction, and it's coming through a border where people are taking advantage of our good hearts. So at the end of the day, we need to shut the border down. I totally agree. We need to take a look at what the problem is when we're having another generation being addicted to drugs that they don't need to be and they should not be, and we should be protecting them from. With that, I'll go back.
Mr. Lewis
Thank
recognized
you.
for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Jackson Lee, for holding this important hearing. I want to thank all their panelists for your time and expertise today. My first question is to Mr. Maltz. I believe in response to a question from Congressman Correa, you had stated that if someone's addicted, jail time is not the answer. Am I saying that accurately?
My opinion is if somebody's addicted, they need help from an addiction specialist, a medical specialist, a social worker. Putting them in jail is not going to help the problem.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So, Ms. Neil Harris, I believe earlier you had stated that about 90% of the legal drugs are in fact not stopped or caught or interdicted. Is that correct?
Yes, and Mr. Maltz had said that about 10% are stopped or interdicted, which would mean that 90% are not.
So my view is if we keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, that does come close to the definition of insanity. And we've been at this war on drugs for many decades. It does not appear to have gotten better. It actually appears to have gotten worse. So it seems to me we should now look at other ways to try to reduce people using drugs, particularly if they're addicted. Because if they're addicted, it seems to me that it's a medical issue. What we actually would need is treatment. And so I'd like to ask about opioids. And Ms. Neil Harris, I'll ask you this. So it seems like part of the reason there's an opioid epidemic is because people would get prescription opioids because they got into a car injury or some other sort of surgery or something where they wanted to relieve pain. The doctor prescribed it. And then all of a sudden, 2 months later, they realized they're addicted to this. It's not like they went and sought out to get addicted. Does it make any sense to put those people into jail?
Thank you for that question. And no, it does not make sense to put those people in jail. And I'd like to briefly clarify the distinction between dependence and addiction. And it's an important one to make when we're talking about opioids. If I got surgery and had to take opioids for an extended amount of time, if I had to take them, say, for 10 days straight, my body would become physically dependent on those drugs. It would be difficult for me for a few days to stop using them. That is a different process than psychological addiction. What happens when people take these drugs, it doesn't only alleviate physical pain, it also helps them feel better about other things that are wrong in their lives. And we've talked a lot here about the root causes of addiction: poverty, inequality, mental health problems, mental illness, physical illness, all of these things. And so if we really want to address the roots of psychological addiction for opioids and for all drugs, we really have to invest in addressing those systemic issues that lead to addiction.
Thank you. Ms. Austin Hillary, in your statement, you talk about decriminalization. So I support Chairman Nadler's efforts to legalize marijuana. I believe that cannabis is no more dangerous than alcohol, and in many situations, it's actually less dangerous. And I think it's just a remarkably stupid use of federal resources to spend even a single penny trying to prosecute and jail people for cannabis use. However, I do recognize that some opioids are in fact more dangerous than alcohol. But I'm curious, Ms. Austin-Hillary, what would it look like if we were to decriminalize opioid use?
Congressman, thank you for that question. I would point back to an example that I brought up during my oral testimony and that I've also included in my written testimony, which is that there are templates available when we look at countries such as Portugal. When Portugal applied to decriminalization, that didn't mean that there were absolutely no crimes related to drugs any further. That just meant they were smarter about drugs, and they were smarter about making sure that individuals who use drugs for personal use were not then penalized for that. Personal drug use is an issue that mostly involves that person, and it is about their personal choice, and that is a right. And that's how they started to look at that issue. Now, there are other issues related to drugs in Portugal for which one does get brought into the criminal justice system. But again, they don't treat it with one broad brush. They look in particular at the different drugs. They look at the different outcomes. They look at how communities are impacted, and they make decisions based on those differences. That's what we need to do if we were to look, and we should look at decriminalizing drugs for personal use here in the United States.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now I will call on the gentleman from Tennessee for 5 minutes. Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate your calling this hearing on this important subject. One of the most pressing subjects we can deal with in criminal justice, and Mr. Liu was right, it's insanity to continue dealing with it in the same way. We've had a failure for years. We fail, we fail, we fail. We need to try something different. Let me ask the panel a question, and I don't know who the right responder may be. Let me start with Ms. Harris, because I liked your 5 minutes. I agreed with everything you said. I read that Mexico may be decriminalizing or legalizing recreational marijuana. Have you seen that story?
Yes, Congressman, I have.
Assuming they do, how's that going to affect the drug situation as far as Mexico, the cartels, the United States goes? I mean, if there's legal recreational marijuana in Mexico, does that take away from the cartel strength? What happens?
I think that legalization in Mexico will reduce the cannabis aspect of their business model. However, the cartels are essentially, like Fortune 500 companies. They are well-run business organizations. They have been able to capitalize on prohibition that we have in this country and have been able to profit immensely off of supplying the demand that we have here and have not addressed. And so they've made an immense profit off of that. I think that they can, they have diversified to other sources of revenue, such as human trafficking and the trafficking in other goods besides drugs and besides people. So I do think that the issue of the cartel is one that is a complicated issue to address. That I think that legalizing cannabis here and in Mexico is one step to addressing. I think that if we decriminalize drugs and remove all of the profit that comes along with supplying the demand of drugs from the cartels, that will also help to put a dent in their businesses and in the violence that they perpetuate.
Exactly. Okay. Let me ask you this too: an arrest or conviction for even a minor drug offense in the United States can have lifelong consequences to the individual who's been arrested for convicted of that crime. They may not be able to get a job. They may not be able to obtain a loan, professional license. Maybe they can't get a college scholarship for housing, federal housing, et cetera. Tell me a little more about these collateral consequences and other solutions to address this unfair impact on our criminal justice system.
Thank you for that question. You really just explained a lot of those collateral consequences that people have. It really can damage their employment prospects, especially when we treat drug possession as a felony, which in my state of Texas we do. And the possession of any amount of drugs other than cannabis is a felony charge. That's on a person's record. It impedes their ability to get a job. It impedes their ability to get assistance with housing, with employment, with education. It can impede their parental rights. There has been legislation at the federal level to bar discrimination from federal loans for education for past drug convictions. I think that's excellent. I think that we need to work to provide for expungement for people's records to make that process automatic so that people don't have to navigate through the bureaucracy of the legal system to have that happen. I also think that all of the reforms that we've been talking about here about reducing mandatory minimums, about reducing drug disparities, all of those need to be retroactive so that people currently serving sentences for those things can be released for them as well. I'm sorry, I think you might be muted.
Mr. Cohen, you may be muted. We're not hearing you.
This could be the DEA interfering with the phone.
Here you are. We can hear you.
Great. Ms. Austin Hillary, I have a bill that would allow federal judges to expunge an individual's record if they go 7 years without any kind of offense at all, if they had just a victimless drug crime. Do you think that would be good? How do you feel that collateral affect people?
Congressman, I think that would be an excellent piece of legislation. What we need to do is to give people second chances. That's really what we're talking about. When you were addressing the collateral consequences, it is about giving people opportunities. We should not punish people for the rest of their lives for issues related to drugs. Your bill would do just that. And the people who find that have the hardest time getting second chances are the Black and brown and poor people who are most impacted by these onerous laws. So yes, I would welcome your legislation.
And unfortunately, my time is expired, so I yield back to Alan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cohen. Thank you for your testimony. Let me quickly allow Mr. Biggs for a quick clarifying question and submission of documents in the record.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate your courtesy. I won't read all of these because I think there's 13 of them, but I'm going to submit these articles, everything from Washington Post to Washington Times and a host of others dealing with the topic of the day.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And then, Mr. Maltz, my clarifying question for you is in response to something that Professor Harris said when she talked about the increase in drug trafficking is in part, at least, due to prohibition policies with regard to drugs. And that's an interesting, there is an interesting contraindication. In some corridors right now, the #1 drug being illegally transited into the United States is marijuana. And this is the case, well, and in Colorado, they've seen an increase in black market marijuana. And this is the case even though marijuana is legalized in many states, including Colorado. And the rationale that has been suggested, not today by anybody on the panel, but in other studies that I've read, is that domestic pot costs more because of taxes and regulatory schemes, and that because of those additional tax burdens and regulatory burdens, what we see is it is still cheaper for cartels to transit a pot across the border where they can't create the grow houses that they're creating in the United States. Is that accurate?
Yes, I mean, the people that are using marijuana do not want to pay these exorbitant prices that they would have to pay because of the taxes. So the black market's going to explode, and the Chinese and the cartels are going to continue to get the marijuana into the United States. We see the same thing with cigarette trafficking, right? People don't want to pay $13 a pack of cigarettes in New York City, so they buy the cigarettes in the black market. This is nothing new, and it's going to continue.
Thank you, and I appreciate the chair.
Not at all to the ranking member. Let me quickly clarify 2 points. First of all, quickly, Dr. Henderson, if you could, there was some discussion about middle-class African Americans and maybe suggesting that why is this happening? This does not necessarily need to happen to a population of African Americans. Can you do a deep dive very quickly on why the idea of addiction and possession for African Americans winds up with incarceration and mass incarceration?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to chime in here. One of the realities that we understand, and I want to correct the record, supply side drug interdiction has never worked. It's never been effective in any period of the war on drugs. We understand that. We also understand that 75% of the individuals who have been convicted at the federal level for fentanyl have been people of color. But when you talk about the decimation of the Black community, we understand that ultimately the Black community and the Hispanic community and overall poor community have received the brunt of the bad drug policies in this country. We understand the impact of the school to prison pipeline. We understand the reality of being incarcerated, and we understand the mark of a criminal record. And I think this committee for having the opportunity to conversate about possible solutions to moving this country in the right direction. But ultimately, we have to reframe our thinking in the right direction and focus on harm reduction.
Thank you. Ms. Austin Hillary, a quick response to that dichotomy.
I am in complete agreement with Mr. Henderson. It is those very circumstances that lead to disparities. And I also need to point out that there are economic changes that make it very difficult to compare the circumstances that existed for African Americans 40 and 50 years ago than exist now. Changes such as gentrification and other kinds of policy reforms have made the African American experience different and in many ways more difficult for African Americans to access some of the benefits that they might have had available to them previously. So we have to keep these in context.
Thank you, Mr. Moss. Very quickly, you indicated that you were being stifled through some technology in terms of what information you can secure. And I want to make it very clear against the murderous big guys like the cartels. What was that specifically that you said that you were being stymied because of the encrypted aspects of what of the work that you were trying to do or what you were trying to obtain?
Thank you for the concern. So obviously the communications are very vital to a law enforcement investigation. And if the bad guys are using encrypted apps that are being used every day all over America, law enforcement's not going to be able to intercept the content pursuant to a federal court order. So we have to look closer at the encryption issue with these new types of technologies.
Excellent. Thank you. I wanted to clarify that for the record.
Thank you.
Ensure all of us against the murderous bad guys. Thank you so very much. Let me indicate that we appreciate very much the witnesses who have been very open and very provocative and very thorough. Let me thank Nicole Austin Hillary, Executive Director of the Human Rights Watch, Dr. Howard Henderson, Director of the Center for Justice Research, Texas Southern University, Derek Maltz, 28 years in public service with DEA, and Dr. Catherine Neal Harris, the Alfred C. Glassell III Fellow in Drug Policy at Rice University. Thank you very much for your testimony. This concludes today's hearing. Thank you to our distinguished witnesses for attending. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions that the witness or additional materials for the record. The hearing is adjourned. Thank you again.